Have you noticed that even when you try your hardest to change, new habits, new routines, new goals, everything somehow slides back to the same familiar pattern? It's as if life keeps replaying itself under a different disguise. You push harder, you organize, you visualize, and still the outcome loops. The strangest part, it happens most when you're doing everything right. But what if the real problem isn't in what you're doing, but in who is watching what you do? There's a silent, measurable force, the observer within you, quietly shaping every result without lifting a finger. You wake up determined. Today, you'll finally change that pattern. Eat differently, react differently, think differently. You've made the list, visualized the outcome, promised yourself this time will be different. But by noon, the same impulses pull you back, quietly, almost invisibly. It's as if the part of you that decides and the part of you that acts don't live in the same house. This is where the fatal mistake begins. We believe that change comes from force, from doing more, pushing harder, controlling thoughts, managing emotions. We build our lives around effort, as though the universe responds only to movement. Yet what if most of our actions are just reactions wearing the mask of free will? There's a strange tension in the human mind. The more we try to control ourselves, the more resistance we create. The act of trying implies a separation, a belief that there's a you who must fix you. It sounds noble, but it quietly builds a war inside your own perception. And every war drains energy from the one place that truly changes everything: awareness. Think about how you learned to drive. At first, every movement demanded effort. You watched the road, your hands, the mirrors, your feet, but over time the actions became automatic. Your brain built a network of responses so efficient that you could drive home and barely remember how you got there. This is the gift and the trap of the mind: efficiency without awareness. So when you decide, I'll be calmer, or I'll stop procrastinating, you're trying to use one layer of programming to rewrite another, and the deeper layer always wins. You're commanding the surface of the ocean while the currents below keep their own direction. That's why no matter how many affirmations you say or goals you write, something stronger keeps pulling you toward the familiar. The true mistake isn't the lack of discipline, it's the confusion between doing and seeing. Action without awareness is like painting in the dark. You're busy, you're moving, but you have no idea what you're actually creating. Here's the paradox. When you stop forcing action and start noticing what's already acting through you, a different kind of intelligence begins to emerge. You see that your anger doesn't appear out of nowhere. You notice that your procrastination is not laziness, but fear of imperfection. You observe that your need to control is really a form of insecurity, disguised as responsibility. These recognitions, simple, silent, are not passive. They are neurochemical shifts, microscopic awakenings that rewire behavior from the inside out. But most people never reach that level of clarity because they're trapped in the loop of self-improvement. They keep doing awareness instead of being aware. They meditate to become calm, journal to find answers, breathe to get rid of anxiety, always trying to get somewhere else. Yet awareness doesn't work that way. It doesn't seek an outcome. It simply sees. There's a quiet moment, right before any reaction, where your mind is still open. That's where awareness lives, but it's so brief that only a trained observer catches it, the flicker between stimulus and response. The moment you learn to stand there, to watch instead of act, your entire pattern begins to dissolve. Still, it feels dangerous. Doing nothing feels irresponsible. The ego hates stillness because it measures value through movement. It whispers, if I don't act, I'll lose control. But the irony is that the more you try to control, the less control you have, because control is rooted in fear, and fear distorts perception. So the next time you feel the urge to fix yourself, pause. Notice the energy of that urge. Where does it begin in your body? Is it tightness in the chest, pressure in the head, a restless impulse to move? That's awareness meeting the machinery of habit. You don't need to change it, just witness it. This is the first fracture in the illusion that doing equals changing. It's also the doorway to something most people never explore, the invisible power that shapes behavior without effort. Because once you see how attention itself rewires reality, you begin to understand that observation isn't passive. It's the very mechanism through which transformation happens. And that's where we turn next, to the invisible power that operates beneath every thought, every choice, every moment you notice instead of react. The hidden scientist within you, quietly rewriting your life each time you observe. Imagine you're sitting in a cafe, lost in thought, watching people pass by. Someone laughs, a spoon falls, a barista wipes a counter. To anyone else, it's a normal scene, but inside your brain, something astonishing is happening. Every flicker of attention you give to that laughter, that sound, that gesture, is literally reshaping the structure of your neural pathways. Observation is not neutral, it's biological sculpting. Neuroscience has shown this again and again. What you pay attention to grows stronger. When a certain pattern of neurons fires together repeatedly, they wire together. This is Hebb's law, one of the simplest yet most profound discoveries in brain science. Neurons that fire together wire together. But the inverse is also true. What you stop observing begins to fade, to lose definition, to dissolve from the active map of your brain. This means attention is not just awareness, it's construction. Every time you observe a thought, a feeling, a behavior, you're feeding energy into it. You're reinforcing that neural circuit, making it easier for your mind and body to repeat the same response tomorrow. The act of observation is like sunlight on a seed. Whatever you shine it on grows. So let's bring this down from theory to experience. Suppose you're anxious about an upcoming conversation. You start rehearsing what could go wrong, what the other person might say, how you'll respond. You think you're preparing, but you're actually rehearsing anxiety. Each mental image, each what-if, strengthens the neural network associated with fear and uncertainty. Your brain doesn't distinguish between imagined and real experience. It just responds to what you observe. This is why you can't escape certain emotional cycles by willpower alone. You can't outthink a circuit that's constantly being reinforced by your own attention. The harder you try to not feel anxious, the more you're observing anxiety, and the more deeply that pattern takes root. It's not self-sabotage, it's neuroplasticity at work. But here's where the invisible power begins to reveal itself. When you shift observation from identification to witnessing, everything changes. Instead of being inside the anxiety, you begin to watch it. You notice its rhythm, how it rises, peaks, fades. You name it without judgment. You realize it's not you feeling anxious, it's your nervous system producing a familiar pattern. And in that moment of awareness, the circuit starts to weaken. Functional MRI studies show that when people mindfully observe their emotions rather than react to them, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of conscious regulation, lights up, while the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, quiets down. Observation, not suppression, creates balance. It's as if the observer steps in and rewires the orchestra, gently retuning the instruments. You can test this in real time. The next time you feel a wave of irritation or restlessness, don't rush to fix it. Just name it. This is irritation. Feel where it lives. Maybe the shoulders tighten, the jaw hardens, the breath shortens. Hold your attention there without trying to change it. Within seconds, something subtle happens. The feeling begins to shift on its own. The system recognizes it's being watched, and the physiology reorganizes. Observation introduces coherence where there was noise. This coherence is measurable. Heart rate variability, brainwave synchronization, even hormonal balance can change when the observer becomes steady. The mechanism is still being studied, but the direction is clear. Conscious attention organizes chaotic systems. The observer doesn't just see, it stabilizes. That's the invisible power most people never use. They live inside their thoughts, unaware that attention itself is the architect of those thoughts. But once you start noticing what you notice, you begin to reclaim authorship of your own mind. You see how self-image, behavior, and perception are not static traits but living patterns responding to observation. So when you catch yourself saying, "That's just how I am," realize that what you're really saying is, "That's what I keep observing." You're describing a habit of attention, not a fixed identity. And that distinction between who observes and what is observed is the line between being trapped by your programming and transforming it. Knowing this already changes your level of control. Because once you understand that observation is the foundation of neuroplasticity, you no longer chase transformation. You allow it. You stop asking, "How do I change my life?" and start asking, "What am I actually feeding with my attention right now?" And this realization leads to a deeper paradox, one that will turn everything you believe about consciousness upside down. If so much of life is shaped by what we observe, what happens when observation itself becomes automatic? When awareness turns into routine? That's where the next secret begins to unfold. Inside the strange paradox of automatic consciousness. You've probably had this experience. You're driving home and suddenly you realize you don't remember the last 10 minutes of the trip. You stopped at the lights, took the right turns, stayed in your lane, all flawlessly, yet your mind was somewhere else entirely. You were thinking about a conversation, a deadline, a memory, and still the car moved. The body acted perfectly without you. This is automatic consciousness, the paradoxical state where awareness continues to operate beneath awareness itself. It's not unconsciousness, not exactly. It's a system that has learned your patterns so well that it no longer needs your active participation. It's your mind's efficiency mode, built through repetition and reinforced through observation, whether intentional or not. Research suggests that around 95% of what we do, feel, and decide happens beneath conscious awareness. Every morning routine, emotional reaction, and habitual thought is a script that has already been rehearsed thousands of times. We like to believe we are choosing in real time, but in truth, most of our choices are echoes of previous choices, pre-recorded decisions replayed automatically by a deeply conditioned network of neural shortcuts. This is not a flaw in the system, it's a brilliant design. The brain saves energy by delegating repeated tasks to the subconscious, freeing up resources for new challenges. The problem arises when the same mechanism that drives a car or brushes teeth also drives our emotional lives. We end up reliving old stories, defending outdated beliefs, and reacting to present situations with ancient responses. We call it personality, but much of what we call who I am is simply what has been automated. Here's where the paradox deepens. Consciousness builds the automatic, and then the automatic hides consciousness. What begins as a creative act of awareness becomes a mechanical loop that runs on its own. You once chose to react with anger, to protect yourself from pain. You once decided to work late because you equated productivity with worth. But after enough repetitions, those decisions became reflexes, no longer chosen, just executed. The observer fell asleep while the machine kept running. And so you might wake up one day realizing that your life is full of efficient patterns that no longer serve you. You react before thinking, apologize before meaning, promise before understanding why. It's as if your nervous system is living your life faster than your awareness can catch up. That's the paradox of automatic consciousness. You're awake, but you're not aware. You can feel this paradox physically. The body moves, but the inner witness lags behind. You respond to an email with irritation, and only afterward do you notice the tension in your jaw. You finish a meal and realize you barely tasted it. You check your phone, not because you want to, but because something invisible inside you decided before you could intervene. There's a faint echo of helplessness in those moments, the sense that life is being lived through you, rather than by you. Yet, this paradox contains a hidden opportunity. Because if awareness can fall asleep inside automation, it can also wake up inside it. The same mechanism that traps you can liberate you. The key lies in noticing the automatic, not judging, not trying to stop it, but catching it in the act. That small act of recognition interrupts the loop. For a fraction of a second, the machinery pauses and the observer reappears. Imagine watching yourself reach for your phone automatically. In that moment of noticing, the habit has been illuminated. You haven't changed it yet, but you've seen it. And seeing it begins to rewrite the pattern. The neural circuit loses its invisibility. It becomes conscious again. Awareness reclaims territory from automation. This is what mindfulness really means at its core, not the soft escape of calm breathing, but the fierce clarity of catching the unseen mechanics of your own mind. You become both actor and audience, both the system and its witness. And the more you practice observing automation, the more your awareness begins to infiltrate it. The autopilot doesn't disappear, but it starts to cooperate with consciousness instead of replacing it. There's something humbling about realizing how much of life runs without our permission. But there's also power in it. Because the moment you see that 95% of your experience is programmable, you begin to wonder, if so much of me is automated, what happens when I stop trying to change the machine and start simply observing it? That question opens a doorway into the next revelation, one that overturns our entire idea of effort and transformation. What if you don't actually need to fight your habits at all? What if the real change happens precisely when you stop trying to change? You've spent your whole life believing that change demands effort, that progress is the sum of discipline, structure, and persistence, that if you want to become someone new, you must wrestle the old self into submission. But what if that equation is wrong? What if the force you've been using to transform yourself is the very thing keeping you stuck? Here's the paradox no one tells you. The harder you try to change, the deeper the old pattern digs in. It's not a failure of willpower. It's physics of the mind. Every act of force creates equal resistance. When you push against what you are, the system pushes back, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. Your psyche was built to maintain coherence. It doesn't care whether your pattern makes you happy, it only cares that it stays consistent. That's why diets rebound, resolutions fade, and habits relapse. The unconscious mind treats every radical act of self-improvement as a threat to its identity map. You say, "I'm going to become disciplined," and it hears, "I'm trying to erase who I am." So it fights back with subtle precision, distraction, fatigue, rationalization, forgetfulness. You think you're sabotaging yourself, but really, the system is defending its coherence. So here's the expectation break. You don't need to try to change. You only need to observe what's already happening. That sentence might sound like heresy in a culture addicted to action. We've built entire industries on the belief that effort equals evolution, self-help, productivity, motivation, discipline. But the deepest transformations happen not through exertion, but through awareness. Observation is the fulcrum of all change because it reveals the hidden structure of your inner machinery. You cannot fight what you don't see, but once you see it, the fight becomes unnecessary. Imagine you're standing in front of a mirror, trying to fix your reflection. You press on the glass, you adjust your stance, you strain your body, yet the image remains the same. Eventually, you realize the only way to change the reflection is to change yourself, not the mirror. Awareness is that realization. The mirror never needed fixing, it only needed noticing. When you begin to observe your thoughts, behaviors, and reactions without trying to correct them, something subtle but radical occurs. The system that was once mechanical starts to reorganize. The simple act of sustained attention exposes inconsistencies in your automatic patterns, and those inconsistencies weaken the old network. You're not breaking habits, they're unraveling under the light of awareness. Take a simple example. You catch yourself checking your phone every few minutes. Normally, you'd scold yourself, "I need more focus," and try to resist. But what if you just watch the impulse? You feel the hand moving toward the phone. You notice the anticipation in the chest, the flicker of restlessness in the mind. No judgment, no suppression, just seeing. Within seconds, something changes. The impulse loses its authority. You've reclaimed the one space where transformation actually happens, the gap between awareness and action. The world teaches us that doing creates results, but in consciousness, seeing is doing. The moment you witness your own pattern clearly, you've already altered it. Because pure observation and repetition cannot coexist for long. One is awareness, the other is automation, and they occupy the same energy field in opposite ways. Awareness dissolves what cannot survive the light of attention. This is not passive. It's not doing nothing. It's the most active act in the universe, the act of seeing reality without interference. It's not about ignoring change or surrendering responsibility. It's about understanding that your deepest shifts come from precision, not force. Just as a scientist observes an experiment to gather truth before acting, you begin to treat your mind as a living laboratory. You stop being the frantic participant and become the quiet researcher. And as you observe more often, something fascinating begins to happen. The intensity of self-conflict decreases. You stop oscillating between motivation and guilt. You stop chasing better versions of yourself because you start to sense that awareness itself is evolution, not the fantasy of becoming, but the practice of perceiving. So, the first plot twist is not a trick of words, it's an unveiling of mechanics. Less effort equals more change, because the deeper truth is that what transforms you isn't the movement of your will, but the stillness of your perception. Of course, this stillness carries its own danger, a trap most people don't see coming. Observation itself can become distorted, fragmented, chaotic, and when that happens, the silent power that frees you can turn into the very thing that binds you. The next step is to look directly at that danger, the peril of a distracted observer. Observation is the quiet engine of transformation, but like any force of nature, it has a shadow side. The same attention that can realign your inner world can also fragment it if scattered, diluted, or hijacked by noise. The observer is powerful only when it's coherent. When awareness is fractured, it turns from compass to storm. We live in the age of divided perception. Every moment, something is fighting for your attention. Notifications, opinions, images, microbursts of stimulation that fracture your focus into smaller and smaller shards. You think you're aware, but what you're really doing is surfing fragments of awareness, never staying anywhere long enough to see truth form. It's like trying to understand the ocean by staring at one wave for half a second before turning away. The distracted observer is not an absent one. It's worse, it's an observer that believes it's watching while actually being carried away. You scroll through your thoughts the way you scroll through a feed, glancing, judging, skipping, reacting. You mistake motion for mindfulness. You call it multitasking, but it's actually multi-escaping, a constant avoidance of sustained contact with your own mind. And here's the danger. What you observe, you strengthen. So when your observation is chaotic, your life becomes chaotic. The brain learns by association. Every time you flicker from one stimulus to another, your neural networks rehearse fragmentation. The result is an inner world that mirrors the same flickering instability, thoughts that won't settle, emotions that change shape too fast to decode, decisions that dissolve before they solidify. There's an experiment in cognitive science called the attentional blink. When two images flash before your eyes in rapid succession, you often miss the second one entirely. Your brain, overloaded, can't register both. Modern life has turned the attentional blink into a lifestyle. We're missing half of our inner experience simply because our observation window keeps blinking shut. When this happens, awareness loses its depth. Instead of perceiving layers, you perceive surfaces. You feel something but can't locate its source. You want clarity, but get noise. And then you mistake the noise for your identity. I'm anxious, I'm unfocused, I can't meditate. But the truth is, your consciousness is simply overstimulated. Not broken, just scattered. The distracted observer is also easily deceived. When attention is fragmented, it can no longer distinguish between what's real and what's reaction. You begin to mistake opinions for truth, emotions for evidence, impulses for intuition. You end up reacting to the echo of your perception rather than to reality itself. In that feedback loop, even genuine awareness becomes counterfeit. It feels like insight, but it's actually just stimulation disguised as meaning. So how do you escape this trap? You don't force focus, that only adds more tension. You notice the fragmentation. You become aware of the very state of being distracted. If you can catch the moment your mind jumps from one thing to another, that noticing is already coherence returning. It's not about concentration, it's about contact. You don't grab your awareness, you invite it back. Try this for 1 minute. Look at something ordinary. Your hand, a glass of water, the sound of air conditioning. Don't analyze it, just stay with it gently. Feel how the attention tries to flee after a few seconds. A thought about tomorrow, an itch, a memory. That movement of escape is the distraction you're trying to understand. Watching it without judgment is how coherence begins to rebuild. Over time, this quiet discipline creates a different rhythm in the brain. Neural synchrony increases, emotional noise decreases. You start to sense the difference between observation that sees and observation that consumes. The first opens clarity, the second feeds chaos. And in that subtle discernment lies freedom, the ability to stay present long enough for transformation to take root. The real enemy of awakening isn't ignorance, it's dispersion. A scattered observer can't perceive cause and effect. It can't see how small inner choices ripple outward into physical outcomes. But the moment you stabilize observation, patterns that once seemed mysterious become visible. You start to recognize how reality itself bends around the quality of your attention. Now pause for a second. Ask yourself, how scattered have I been today? Not to judge, but to see. Awareness begins exactly there, with that quiet honesty. And if this reflection struck something real in you, take a moment to anchor it. Hit like as a tiny act of coherence, a conscious gesture saying, I notice this. And in the comments, write one word that describes what your attention feels like right now. Foggy, sharp, restless, anchored, whatever it is. Naming the state of your awareness is how the observer wakes up. Because once you name it, you can begin to work with it. And that's where the next revelation unfolds. How the observer doesn't just see your life, but silently reprograms it from within. If you could look inside your brain in the very moment you become aware of yourself, truly aware, you would witness an invisible revolution. Tiny electrical storms would begin shifting direction. Silent chemical messengers would change routes. Neurons that once fired in fixed patterns would start hesitating, searching for new partners. This is neuroplasticity in its purest form, the nervous system rewriting its own script, not through effort or repetition, but through observation itself. We often think of neuroplasticity as the result of doing, practicing an instrument, learning a language, exercising, meditating. And while repetition strengthens the neural circuits of any skill, there's another layer far more subtle and powerful, the layer of conscious observation. When you watch a mental or emotional pattern with sustained awareness, you activate the very regions of the brain responsible for self-regulation, empathy, and learning. The prefrontal cortex begins to coordinate with the limbic system, creating a bridge between your ancient impulses and your higher intelligence. What's fascinating is that this bridge doesn't require physical action to form. You can literally reprogram your brain by watching it work. The act of observing thought, emotion, or sensation triggers the same networks that would be used to change them through behavior. But now, instead of brute force, the transformation happens through coherence, the alignment of neural activity toward clarity rather than reaction. Let's make this concrete. Imagine you're feeling the onset of anger. Normally, you might express it, suppress it, or redirect it. All those responses reinforce the same circuitry. They're forms of reaction. But when you simply observe anger, when you say inwardly, anger is arising, you've shifted from being inside the circuit to seeing it from outside. That shift of vantage point changes brain activation immediately. Blood flow moves away from the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, and toward the prefrontal cortex, which governs reflection and choice. In measurable terms, awareness itself begins to deactivate reactivity. Neuroscientist Richard Davidson calls this the mindfulness feedback loop. The more you witness an emotion without judgment, the faster the brain learns to calm itself. You're training it not by suppression or indulgence, but by showing it that another mode of operation is possible, one that doesn't rely on fight or flight. Over time, the baseline activity of stress circuits decreases, while networks related to compassion and resilience strengthen. It's as though awareness acts like a tuning fork placed inside the nervous system. Wherever you place it, in the middle of thought, pain, craving, fear, the surrounding frequencies start to align with its tone. Observation introduces order where there was randomness, rhythm where there was noise. You don't do the reprogramming. The nervous system does it for you when you stop interfering. But this process requires sincerity, not technique. If you observe with an agenda, if you're secretly trying to fix or eliminate what you're watching, the old circuits stay active. The brain senses resistance and defends its pattern. Observation works only when it's pure, when you allow what's there to be there, long enough for the system to see itself clearly. That clarity is what dissolves the pattern, not force. We can even see this in micro moments of daily life. You might notice your shoulders tighten during a meeting. Instead of stretching them immediately, you just watch the tension. You notice how the breath shortens, how the stomach subtly contracts. After a few seconds of sustained awareness, the muscles begin to release on their own. What happened physiologically is this: observation reduced sympathetic arousal, the stress response, and activated the parasympathetic system, which governs rest and restoration. No external action was required. It's humbling to realize how much of your life is shaped by processes you can't see and yet can influence simply by watching. This is the biological foundation of consciousness, the mind's ability to modulate its own machinery through attention. When the observer turns inward, the observed begins to change. And the beauty of it is that you don't need to understand the change. The nervous system does the work in silence. This principle explains why deep personal shifts often feel effortless once awareness is strong enough. You might spend years trying to change a behavior, and then one day, after a moment of clear observation, it simply drops away. Not because you conquered it, but because your brain restructured around a higher coherence. The old pattern couldn't find support in a mind that sees too clearly. So the observer doesn't reprogram by effort, it reprograms by revelation. Every time you hold awareness steady, neurons recalibrate, circuits of avoidance weaken, circuits of presence strengthen. You're literally sculpting a new nervous system, one that prefers truth over habit, attention over reaction. And as this process deepens, another mystery begins to unfold. Science can explain the mechanics of neuroplasticity, but there's a dimension even subtler, a domain where observation seems to influence not just your brain, but the very reality around you. It's here that the question shifts from how does awareness rewire the mind to how does awareness itself alter the field of experience? That's where the quantum observer enters the scene. There's a point where the language of neuroscience begins to blur into something more mysterious, where the act of observation doesn't just reshape your mind, but appears to influence the very behavior of matter itself. For more than a century, physicists have wrestled with this unsettling fact. The universe behaves differently when it is being observed. In the early 20th century, experiments like the double-slit test revealed something no one expected. When electrons were fired through two slits toward a detection screen, they behaved like waves, spreading out, interfering, creating a pattern of probability. But the moment someone measured which slit an electron passed through, the pattern collapsed into particles. The act of observation changed the outcome. It was as though nature refused to reveal her full dance unless someone was watching, and watching altered the choreography. This isn't pseudoscience or mystical exaggeration, it's the foundation of quantum mechanics. The observer effect doesn't mean your thoughts create reality in a magical way, but it does mean that observation is woven into the fabric of how reality manifests. Every measurement, every act of defining, limits a field of possibilities into one concrete event. The observer, in a very real sense, participates in the creation of what is seen. Now imagine scaling that principle back down to the intimate field of your own life. You too live in a quantum field of probabilities, countless possible behaviors, emotions, and outcomes coexisting until one becomes real through attention. Every time you observe yourself, you collapse a range of possibilities into a chosen expression. Observation determines manifestation. The science may sound abstract, but the experience is profoundly personal. Consider the way attention works in the brain. Before you focus on something, multiple neural networks compete for dominance. Fragments of thought, sensation, memory. But once you direct awareness, the brain collapses these potentials into a single coherent state. One network wins, one reality crystallizes. On a biological scale, your neurons are doing what electrons do in the quantum field, responding to observation by choosing form. This means your perception isn't just a lens, it's a generator. The way you observe a moment literally defines its structure. If you look at a conversation through the lens of defensiveness, you collapse the potential for understanding into conflict. If you observe the same moment through curiosity, you collapse it into connection. The external event might be identical, but your attention determines which version of reality you inhabit. Even quantum theorists like John Wheeler propose that the universe is participatory, that reality doesn't exist fully formed, waiting to be discovered, but evolves through interaction with the observer. Wheeler called it the delayed choice experiment. Depending on whether observation occurs before or after a photon's path, its past behavior appears to change. The implications are staggering. Observation doesn't just influence the present, it can rewrite the apparent past of a system. Now translate that insight into the psychology of your own story. Every time you observe a memory from a higher state of awareness, you alter your relationship with it. You change not the event itself, but its emotional and neurological encoding. In other words, by observing differently, you rewire the past's influence on the present. What used to be a wound becomes wisdom. What was once shame becomes neutrality. Observation travels backward through time, changing the narrative you live by. This is why healing, at its deepest level, feels less like conquering pain and more like seeing it clearly for the first time. You're not changing history, you're changing your participation in it. The observer inside you, the one that sees without resistance, is the quantum participant, collapsing an old reality and allowing a new one to form. Modern physics still debates the true nature of the observer effect. Some argue that consciousness is essential to it, others see it as a limitation of measurement tools. But what's undeniable is that reality, at its smallest scales, refuses to exist independently of interaction. And that's the bridge between science and awareness. Both show that perception is not passive. You are not a spectator of existence. You are a co-author, a participant in the equation that gives reality its structure. Every observation, every moment of seeing without judgment, is a measurement that alters probability. You can't stand outside the universe because your awareness is part of its very code. And this leads to an even subtler truth. If you're constantly observing yourself without realizing it, through assumptions, self-definitions, and unconscious narratives, then those silent observations are shaping the world you walk through. Which raises the next, more challenging question. What happens when you've been observing yourself all along, but from the wrong angle? There's a silent mirror that follows you everywhere. Not the one on your wall, but the one built into your perception. It reflects your self-concept back at you moment by moment, shaping how the world responds to you. The strange part is, you rarely see this mirror directly. You move through life believing you're reacting to reality, but in truth you're reacting to the reflection of how you've been unconsciously observing yourself. Every person carries an invisible image of who they think they are. It's not made of words or logic. It's a set of sensations, micro-thoughts, and emotional tones that loop beneath awareness. When you say, "I'm not good with people," or "I always mess things up," that's not just a belief. It's an ongoing act of self-observation, a constant automatic witnessing of yourself as limited. And because attention reinforces what it touches, that subtle observation becomes the architecture of your reality. You don't even need to repeat it consciously. The loop does the work for you. Each time you enter a situation, your nervous system checks its reference image. Who am I in this scenario? And reality bends around that answer. If the inner observer sees you as anxious, your body prepares to feel anxious. Your tone shifts, your muscles tighten, your perception narrows. The outer world then mirrors that state back, confirming what the inner observer already decided. And you call it proof. This is the hidden loop, the self observing itself into being. It's a feedback circuit between perception and identity. The observer watches, the watched responds, and both reinforce each other until the pattern feels like truth. But what we call truth in daily life is often just repetition, the same signal bouncing between your inner and outer worlds until it feels inevitable. Think about a moment when you expected rejection. Maybe before a conversation, a job interview, or even a date. That expectation was not just a thought. It was a lens of self-observation shaping every micro-action. You unconsciously adjusted your voice, your posture, your eye contact. You sent signals of unease that the other person picked up on. They responded subtly. Maybe they hesitated or looked away, and your brain registered it as confirmation. See, I knew it. But what if you had observed yourself differently in that moment? Not as someone who might be rejected, but as someone simply watching an interaction unfold. The physical cues, the emotional tone, even your perception of the other person would have changed. Because the observer defines the experience before the mind ever interprets it. Neuroscience offers a glimpse into this hidden loop. Studies on predictive processing show that the brain doesn't passively receive information from the world. It predicts it. It constantly generates models of what it expects to see and then filters reality to fit those predictions. Most of what you perceive isn't raw data. It's your brain confirming its own story. In other words, you're not just observing the world, and you're observing your expectations of it. And those expectations are drawn directly from how you've been observing yourself. The same is true for emotional identity. When you unconsciously label yourself, "I'm a calm person," "I'm unlucky," "I'm a perfectionist," your nervous system starts maintaining the chemistry to match that description. Hormones, neurotransmitters, posture, tone of voice, all adapt to uphold that image. You're not stuck because life is stubborn. You're stuck because your self-observer is consistent. But awareness of the loop changes everything. The moment you see that you've been observing yourself into the same outcome, you introduce a new observer, a higher vantage point. It's like stepping out of the mirror and watching the reflection watch you. Suddenly, the identification softens. You begin to sense that your self-image is not solid, just rehearsed. That's where inner freedom begins. Not by building a better self-image, but by realizing you were never the image at all. You were the observer that kept watching it repeat. And once that awareness stabilizes, even slightly, the feedback loop begins to dissolve. The same way a dream fades when you recognize it as a dream, the self-observation patterns start losing their power when they're seen clearly. Still, this process is delicate. You can't destroy the loop by fighting it. That just creates another layer of observation, another identity watching the old one. The key is gentle clarity, catching yourself mid-pattern and seeing the mechanism with neutrality. The more often you do this, the more the system reorganizes itself. You don't replace old beliefs with new affirmations, you simply stop feeding them with unconscious observation. And as the hidden loop loosens its grip, something unexpected happens. The boundary between you and life begins to thin. You start noticing that what's transforming isn't just your inner perception, it's the entire field of experience that reflects it. The world stops looking like a mirror of your conditioning and begins to feel like a living dialogue with your awareness. That's the threshold we're approaching now. The silent alignment that emerges when the observer and the observed are no longer in conflict, when attention becomes so clear that reality itself starts to synchronize with it. There's a moment in the evolution of awareness when something subtle yet irreversible begins to happen. The observer stops chasing its own tail. The effort to fix, to analyze, to redefine dissolves, and what remains is a quiet alignment, not between two separate parts of you, but between seeing and being. The inner commentary fades, and observation ceases to be a mental act. It becomes an atmosphere. This is the silent alignment, the moment when awareness and life begin to move as one continuum. You're still acting, speaking, choosing, but the quality of those movements changes. They stop coming from reaction and begin to arise from coherence. The loop that once made you observe yourself through distortion starts to close, not by intervention, but by exhaustion. The mind simply runs out of fuel for fragmentation. At first, this shift can feel almost imperceptible. You might not even realize it's happening. There's just a growing sense of space around everything, around thoughts, around emotions, even around decisions. Situations that once triggered you seem slower now, easier to see. It's not because the world has softened, it's because you're no longer tangled in your own observation. The observer has become transparent. Neuroscience would call this a state of high neural coherence. Brainwave patterns synchronize, heart rhythms stabilize, hormonal signals align. It's not mystical, it's mechanical. The nervous system thrives on order, and awareness introduces order wherever it's sustained. When perception stops oscillating between judgment and defense, the body stops oscillating too. The entire system begins to hum in one tone, like an orchestra tuning itself after years of dissonance. In this state, attention no longer clings to details or anxiously scans for threats. It widens, it breathes. The prefrontal cortex and limbic system, the centers of reflection and emotion, begin to operate in synchrony. The mind stops treating the body as an instrument to control, and the body stops treating the mind as an intruder. There's a soft collaboration between cognition and sensation, a unity that feels both ancient and newly born. You start to notice this in small ways. Conversations flow without premeditation. You respond, but not from habit, from presence. The need to prove, to defend, to outperform begins to fade. Even silence feels full. Observation has matured beyond analysis. It's now participation without distortion. You're not outside life watching it, you're within it, aware of it, yet unentangled. This alignment isn't something you do, it's what naturally emerges when resistance ends. The mind's filters, the assumptions, the self-images, the judgments, have been seen through enough times that they no longer hold authority. They might still appear, but they dissolve on contact with awareness. The system learns. Observation doesn't need commentary. The beauty of this stage is its ordinariness. It's not ecstatic or dramatic. It's quiet, steady, measurable in the way your shoulders rest, in the rhythm of your breath, in the quality of your sleep. It's the point where your nervous system trusts you again. You've stopped bombarding it with self-conflict, and in return, it opens to a deeper intelligence. This intelligence isn't strategic, it's responsive. It doesn't plan the next moment, it meets it. In psychological terms, this is integration, when your conscious and unconscious processes stop competing. But in lived experience, it feels more like remembering how to move in harmony with something that was never lost, the direct pulse of reality itself. The observer doesn't vanish, it merges. Awareness and experience become a single event unfolding. You can see this alignment in nature. A tree doesn't try to align with sunlight, it simply turns toward it. Its movement is an act of observation, a constant conversation with light. The same principle governs human consciousness. The more your awareness turns toward reality without resistance, the more your life grows in the direction of coherence. And this alignment doesn't erase individuality, it refines it. Your preferences remain, your personality remains, but they're no longer driven by insecurity or defense. You speak when words are needed, you pause when they aren't, and each action feels proportionate to the moment. The old friction, the inner noise of shoulds and musts, begins to dissolve. In this silent clarity, life becomes astonishingly simple. The observer, once a restless analyst, becomes an open window. Everything moves through you, thoughts, sensations, people, choices, but nothing sticks. The field is clear, so the movement of life is clear. And because clarity has replaced control, the world begins to mirror that clarity back to you. Circumstances, relationships, timing, all begin to reflect the coherence of your inner field. That's the closing of the loop, when the observer no longer distorts what it sees. Awareness returns to its original state, not as a tool, but as a condition of existence. You realize that what transforms you isn't a process, but a remembering. And yet, there's one more revelation waiting, a deeper inversion that ties everything together. Because if it's true that observation changes reality, then what happens when you stop even trying to observe consciously? When awareness itself becomes so natural that it no longer belongs to you at all. Here's the part no one expects. After all the effort to awaken the observer, after all the insight about awareness and attention, the final realization arrives like a quiet shock. There is no separate observer at all. The one who's been trying to observe, refine, improve, or even stay present dissolves in its own seeing. What's left isn't someone being aware, it's awareness itself, free from identity. This is the inversion point, the moment the mind stops pretending to be the one controlling awareness and recognizes that it was never in charge. For most of your life, you've lived as if there's a you watching your experience, the watcher and the watched, the thinker and the thought. But when observation matures enough, the boundary between those two collapses. The watcher is revealed to be part of the watched. The mind that tried to observe its patterns is itself a pattern being observed by something far deeper, something that doesn't have a name, a face, or a narrative. At first, this realization can feel disorienting, even unsettling. The ego resists it because it means the end of ownership. The part of you that worked so hard to do awareness right suddenly realizes it was a character in the play all along. You don't lose consciousness. You lose the illusion that consciousness belonged to you. What remains is a vast stillness that doesn't observe from above but from within. The plot twist isn't that awareness changes your life, it's that you never were the one changing it. Awareness has always been operating, silently adjusting, recalibrating, orchestrating experiences to bring you to this recognition. Every attempt to observe better was a step toward exhaustion, until the effort broke under its own weight and revealed what was always true. You don't have awareness, you are awareness. In that instant, the entire model of self-improvement collapses. You no longer stand outside yourself trying to fix the machinery of your mind. You realize there was never a machine to fix, just movement, sensation, thought, arising and dissolving in the same field of consciousness. The observer was never behind the eyes. It was the light shining through them. Neuroscientifically, something remarkable corresponds to this. When people experience what's often described as selfless awareness, the default mode network, the cluster of brain regions that generates our sense of I, me, mine, shows reduced activity. Yet perception remains sharp, sometimes sharper. The brain's usual commentary quiets, but awareness doesn't vanish. It expands beyond the personal story. This isn't mysticism, it's physiology, confirming what consciousness pioneers have said for centuries. When the narrative self drops, awareness doesn't die. It awakens fully. And the consequences are profoundly practical. Once you see that the observer is not an entity, but a function of life itself, you stop arguing with reality. Resistance loses its foundation. You still make choices, but they no longer carry the weight of identity. You still feel emotions, but they pass through without dragging you into their gravity. Life continues, but the sense of a separate me managing it begins to dissolve. What's left is participation without possession, doing without doer, seeing without seer. From this perspective, change happens not because you decide to change, but because reality can finally flow unobstructed. The old circuits, beliefs, and reactions continue to appear, but there's no one left to defend or maintain them. They fade naturally, like ripples on water returning to stillness once the wind stops. And this is where the deeper intelligence of observation becomes obvious. Every stage, the confusion, the distraction, the effort, the letting go, was part of a larger choreography leading here. Awareness used the illusion of separation to guide itself back into unity. It built the ego so it could watch it dissolve. It created the sense of a seeker so that seeking could burn itself out and leave only seeing. It's the most elegant paradox imaginable. The observer changes your life not because it does anything, but because in its pure form it's indistinguishable from life itself. The act of observing and the act of being are one and the same movement. And yet, even this understanding is not the end. The mind still wants to ask, if there's no observer, then who lives this life? Who decides, who feels, who moves? The next realization waits in that question, a deeper recognition that the entire field of reality, inner and outer, personal and cosmic, is a single act of observation unfolding through every form. It's not that awareness belongs to you, but that you belong to awareness. Which brings us to the final turn of this exploration, the answer to the question that started it all. If the observer changes your life without doing anything, what does living look like once you've stopped trying to control it? In the end, everything you've been trying to change was never separate from the one who observed it. Awareness was never a tool. It was the field holding every thought, every effort, every silence. When you stop forcing transformation and simply see, life begins to self-correct. The mind relaxes, the body listens, and reality aligns without struggle. True change is quiet because it doesn't come from doing. It comes from remembering what has always been aware beneath it all. If you reached this point, write "I'm fully aware" in the comments so I'll know you stayed until the end. And if this message resonated with you, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen right now. Each one dives deeper into this same current of awareness, the place where life begins to transform on its own.